Well, I ended the first part with a controversial choice. Time to start this part with another one. Shin Kamen Rider Prologue isn't that great. The titular character Shin is almost as bland as Masaru from Zero, but at least Shin has some glimmers of characterization and character development. Unfortunately, anytime something intriguing occurs that could challenge his character, the film just babies him and absolves Shin from having to do anything or change. Shin believes he's a berserk monster that has killed innocent humans and fears that he could eventually hurt the people closest to him. Could he grow and develop from this situation? Nope. After a 2-minute pep talk from his girlfriend, he just completely stops worrying about it. Plus, the reason for the visions he's been having? Turns out they were actually Gichi's action, and Shin was experiencing it through telepathy. Shin realizes the organization that he sacrificed his humanity and future for has been using him as a pawn for world domination. How does he react to this shocking revelation? He doesn't. He just sorta stares at his crying girlfriend and never thinks about the subject again. The side characters and villains are so bland that they can each be described with one or two traits. Ai is Shin's girlfriend, who also works with the evil villain group. Sarah is a CIA agent that's interested in Shin. Iwao is the leader of the big bad organization called Foundation. Goshima is his right-hand man, and Giichi is the crazy scientist. However, at least Giichi was interesting and genuinely pulled much of the weight in the first half of the film, due to his interesting philosophy and actions. Too bad he was killed off so we could have Iwao and Goshima as the final villains of this film. Bleh. Now the story.
It's so slow. Barely anything happens in this 90-minute film.
There's so much padding to the point where it's nearly insufferable. The first 30 minutes barely do anything to inform us about Shin as a character. Ai and Shin's relationship barely has any focus despite being one of the more prominent parts of the film. The scenes with the CIA feel like a waste of time. The random-ass fetus showing up out of nowhere that has magical powers felt like it was shoved in at the last minute. Basically any scene that involves Iwao just expositing random stuff, and many more issues. Now, I understand that this is a prologue and was setting up the villains, story, and characters for the future, if Shin had had a future. But previous Kamen Rider series had much better first episodes that set up everything. V3, X, Amazon, Super 1, and Black are perfect examples of an introduction done right. However, the reason that this isn't a 1 out of 10 is because the story, while slow, was decent, and Giichi does raise up the cast of characters a bit. Plus, the film does have great special effects. Still, everything about this movie was a snooze fest. Well, it's finally time to say goodbye to this film franchise. Superhero Taisen is the best Taisen film, but even then, it's still pretty trash. To quickly summarize the good parts, the story wasn't terrible, and the film did have moments where I was emotionally invested, mainly any of the scenes involving Joe. Now that all of the good things that I can say about this film are out of the way, let's dive into the trash, shall we? Our central cast of characters is Daiki from Decade, Hina from O's, and Joe and Doc from Gokaiger. Meh is the best word I can use to describe them in this film. They don't do much, and the interactions between the four of them can be summed up as writers and Sentai shouldn't fight against each other. Daiki is probably the most interesting out of the entire group, mainly because of his sudden betrayal at the end of the film. I know that most people rag on Daiki in this film for that betrayal, but actually I kinda thought it fit with his character. I mean, after Tsukasa reveals everything up to that point was just a trick, a very emotionally manipulative trick, I can see why Daiki would want to take revenge in the most extreme way possible. Oh, speaking of Tsukasa, he and Marvelous are the quote-unquote villains of this film. Yeah, sure, Shocker and Zangief eventually usurped that role, but they're both completely pointless and forgettable. Both Tsukasa and Marvelous have pretty much the same characterization in this film. They hate the other franchise because they started killing us first. Now the story. Like I said, the plot is mainly dealing with Sentai and writers trying to kill each other because they started killing us. However, it then turns out to be a giant trick to fool the real villains so they can all join together for a big fight scene against them, which has got to be the second stupidest thing in this film. While you may think the whole killing each other was just a trick was pretty bad, don't worry, it gets way worse. There are many more plot issues that make this story even more terrible. As a disclaimer, I know that most of the story issues I'm going to bring up can be dismissed because it was all a trick, so why does it matter? But I feel like that's just a cop-out to sweep all of those issues under the rug. Alright, back on topic. So, this whole war starts off because Tsukasa/Marvelous killed Akaranger/Ichigo, but the film literally opens with Marvelous killing the 7 legendary riders, which is complete bullshit by the way, which would imply that Marvelous started this whole thing. There is no explanation as to why Zangief and Shocker revived, and they are written to act like complete wimps who can't do anything without Tsukasa/Marvelous awaiting them. Also, Marvelous is somehow able to go back in time alone, despite not having that power. According to my memory, anyways. But the stupidest thing in this film has got to be the revelation that the war actually started because one franchise can't survive if the other continues on. Now, what may sound so wrong with this? Well, it's referring to the quote-unquote fact that if Rider had never lost their time slot back in 1975, Sentai wouldn't have a time slot to air, and therefore Sentai would have never existed. So the entire motivation behind this war was based off a fucking meta joke. A meta joke that no one in universe would have understand. Yeah, even though this film was pretty stupid all the way through, this film is saved by the character interactions, even if they were pretty disappointing, and any emotional moment with Joe. But god, this film was just idiotic. Well, another film that deals with a bunch of heroes. Except not really, since it wasn't the main selling point. Overquarters is disappointing. The writer basically just said fuck it, and threw in a bunch of stuff to try and make a comprehensible story. This film is pretty much split into two parts, the prelude and then the actual film. The prelude, or the first 23 minutes, is legit just all about Sogo gaining the Drive Ride Watch. Anything that happens in this part is never expanded upon. The importance of the cross, how Krim managed to talk to Sogo and the others, what Go was doing at Krim's residence, never expanded upon. The actual plot is dealing with this group called the Quarters, nice title drop by the way, and is ruled by the quote-unquote True Sogo. True Sogo wants to restart the Heisei timeline, and it's up to Sogo to stop him. Anyways, this film doesn't have the greatest plot. There are a bunch of issues with this plot I could go on about. The whole Sengoku era shenanigans that leave zero impact, trying to push the message of live the life the way you want, Heisei riders have monumental impact, and Sogo is actually a good king, all at the same time, just made the whole movie feel messy. There are more story issues, but that's mainly connected with the villains, so I'll talk about that when I get there. With the characters, Sogo does have some depression since he's discovered that basically his entire life was a setup and he's been stealing stuff from other riders, but once again, one pep talk solves all of these issues and Sogo goes back to how he originally was. Hell, he even needed to be reminded why he wants to be king, which is something he spouted since episode 1. Gaze and Tsukiyomi, they do nothing other than spout that Sogo isn't as evil as we thought, so we believe in him now. Waz is the most interesting character in this film. It turns out that he was a member of the Quarters and has been working with True Sogo this entire time. Then he eventually realized that he wants to be with Sogo because Heisei riders have tenacity or something like that. On to the villains and oh boy. Kagan and Jogen are pretty pointless in the grand scheme of things. However, True Sogo is weird. He has no personality other than domineering, and the reasoning for his plan to reset the Heisei era is stupid. He wants to reset it because he finds the Heisei timeline too messy and complex. Sure, this may sound like a dumb but okay explanation, but my issues are with the implications of this motivation. To me, True Sogo's entire character just feels like a derision of the fans who care about continuity in Rider. It seems like the staff just wanted to get back or poke at the fans who point out war issues in Riders by making a villain that basically represented them by having his entire motivation be due to the many different seasons of Rider contradicting each other, so I want to undo it all. I understand that Rider continuity is extremely complex and confusing, but especially in Geo, the staff just seems to take a mindset that people shouldn't point out continuities because it doesn't matter, and we're too lazy to conform to continuity, so we just make stuff up. Hell, this movie seems like it's trying to deflect any story issues by promoting the message of it doesn't matter. Since this film literally ends with Tsukiyomi, Gaze, and Waz suddenly being brought back to life, despite the fact that they all just died. They even acknowledge that they have no idea how they were revived, but Sogo just responds that it doesn't matter. Even if you don't want to care about the continuity, you shouldn't have a villain attacking a part of the fanbase. Also, pointing out your own flaws doesn't automatically fix everything. However, there are some good parts about this film. There are some cool looking shots in this film, and I do like the attempt to have developed Sogo and Waz, even if they both failed in my opinion. But the poor plot, numerous unexplained details, terrible villains, and not utilizing the main cast well don't bring this film up any higher.
Now, we start our delve into another film series, the movie War films. While it was a tough call for which one would end up last, ultimately I decided that Genesis would take that spot. Even though Genesis was the first movie war to break away from the mold of splitting the films into 3 acts, the plot of this film really dragged it down. With regards to the characters, Both Takeru and Shinosuke were alright. However, the film really doesn't do much with expanding them. Takeru developed by proxy of his younger self wanting to stand up for himself, while Shinosuke just had to gather the courage to propose to Kiriko. Now, you could probably infer that this movie deals with time travel, and that this element is the main reason why this plot sucks. Well, congratulations, you're halfway correct. The villains are a group of Ganma who want to rule the world because they're evil. They wreak havoc back in 2005, and it's up to Shinosuke and Takeru to stop them. However, because of the shenanigans in the past, the Roid trio have all revived and have also lost their memories, and for some reason are more evil and powerful than before. But at least Chase is revived, with all of his memories still intact for some reason. Yeah, these villains were pretty bland. The Ganma were generic, and the revived Roid trio just felt like a last-minute addition instead of feeling like they were actually incorporated into the story. Now it's time for the plot. You know how I mentioned that some of the movie's problems were caused by time travel? Well, another reason why this movie has so many problems is because the writer of this film has never worked on either Drive, Ghost, or Kamen Rider in general. So, when Shinosuke and Takeru arrive back in 2005, Shinosuke discovers Krim in a bush, even though the global freeze happened in 2014. Does this mean that Heart killed Krim all the way back in 2005 and then waited 9 years to initiate the global freeze? Why is Krim even at Daitenku Temple? Not to mention that this film kinda invalidates the most emotional moment present in Surprise Future, but that's a spoiler so I won't talk about it now. The Ganma are for some reason able to use heroic spirits, even though all of the Ganma beforehand were using inanimate objects as the basis to transform. Go and Makoto aren't able to use the Ganma icons, but not because they can't use them, but because they don't know much about the spirits residing in them. Even though all you need is the spirit's approval, and even that can be overridden. Also, the reason why Shinosuke and Takeru were able to travel into the past? It's because Ryu somehow summoned them. Yeah, no, that's complete bullshit. Not to mention that this film later ends up contradicting Ghost's lore, since Ryu was killed by one of the Ganma in this film, when it turns out that he was actually killed by Adele. Imagine being so out of touch with the lore, that this film had to be declared non-canon just to fix it. So yeah, this film was a giant mess. The story had a lot of issues, and the villains were pretty disappointing. However, at least the story wasn't completely nonsensical, and there were some good emotional moments with the characters. Well, I had mentioned before that it was a tough call to decide which movie war film was the worst one, and up next is the runner-up, Ultimatum. Can we just ask Toei to stop having writers who have never worked on the featured Kamen Rider series to helm their movies? Like Genesis, the writer of this film had only worked on a short Black RX film and had never worked on Wizard, which is an issue since he's the main writer for both Wizard and the Ultimatum part of this film. Well, at least Fourze's part was decent. It was nice seeing the Kamen Rider Club reunite and having some wacky shenanigans with them. The only faults with this part is the villain Banba being extremely forgettable and over-focused on a completely new character, Saburo, who did have a good arc but kinda felt unimportant, Gentaro destroying his Fourze driver for a really dumb reason, and Gentaro's entire development being summed up as learning to become a better teacher by helping a student change for the better, even though the entirety of Fourze saw him change people for the better, even as a student. Now onto Wizard's portion. It's a real stinker. Haruto doesn't really do much, and the whole plot was a bit confusing. Haruto's tasked with waking up a girl named Poitorine to stop monsters from escaping into reality. That may seem like a simple plot, but it's quite hard to piece together because this portion constantly jumps around without much explanation. For one, the underworld is no longer a dimension of a person's subconscious, but rather a realm underneath the earth, which is just stupid. There are also somehow multiple gates connected to the same underworld, and a person's underworld is treated like a dream instead of a memory of the gate's moment of despair. For the villains, they're the Akamizers, but evil. Ooh. I'll be honest, repurposing other Ishinomori heroes to be villains for the sake of fan service is not respectful in my opinion. Like yeah, turn old heroes into villains for the sake of promotion. I'm sure that has never led to anything bad happening. Dragon Force. The Akamizers as villains are kinda bland. They're evil because they're demons. They want to open portals to the human world so they can invade, yada yada. But why do they need to kidnap people? How are these monsters even created? In the person's underworld? This film just felt confused. Fourze's portion was the only saving grace, but even that wasn't the greatest it could have been. I know the issues I've stated don't seem that atrocious, but if you watch the full film, you might get a better understanding of what I'm talking about. Or maybe not. Oh man, Speaking of movies that don't treat past characters right, yeah, the Ichigo movie, in my opinion, doesn't really portray Takeshi or the original 1971 series in the best light. I get what they were trying to do with Takeshi, but I think they just executed it extremely poorly. In this film, Takeshi is now no longer willing to fight against evil. Now, you could chalk that up because his body is breaking down and he's tired of fighting, but I would still say that goes against his character. But the real reason he doesn't want to fight, it's because he doesn't want to make Mayu, who's Tachibana's granddaughter, sad and alone. Ugh. So, you take the symbol of self-sacrifice and heroism and basically turn him into a selfish boomer who's completely fine with letting evil run rampant on innocent people so long as the people close to him don't have to suffer because of it? Jesus, man. And the reason for him reverting in his character? So he could relearn the lesson that Kamen Riders fight for everyone. As if you needed to relearn that fact. Oh yeah, him being a boomer doesn't just apply to his reasoning of, I don't fight because it would make Mayu sad. He refuses to help Takeru fight against Nova Shocker because, you shouldn't rely on me, and tells him that he'll only help if Takeru finds out why life is important. Even though I'm pretty sure Takeru spouted the importance of life in previous episodes. Takeshi acts like he assumes Takeru wants him to take care of Nova Shocker for him, but Takeru doesn't. He just wants assistants to take them down. And my assumption as to why Takeshi refused to help is because this film tries to present Takeshi as a lone hero, with no comrades and no one important in his life, which is why he gravitated towards Mayu, who is the only remnant of someone close to him. The writer does realize that Takeshi has had many allies over the course of his career, and has relied on countless others. This whole notion of he does everything alone is false. He has relied on Tachibana, Taki, the Rider Scouts, other Kamen Riders, and other allies. For Takeshi to seemingly forget everyone except Tachibana seems really disrespectful, and this lone hero notion, being the basis of wanting to teach Takeru to defeat problems on his own, seems extremely hypocritical, since once again, Takeshi has always had help and relied on others when dealing with problems. Oh, and the greatest thing about Takeshi trying to teach Takeru the importance of life and standing up for himself? When Takeshi is later revived in the film, Takeshi has no qualms with teaming up with Takeru to take down Nova Shocker without even asking if Takeru has learned to stop relying on others or discover the importance of life. So what was even the point of Takeshi refusing to help Takeru in the first place? Ugh, let's just get to the other characters. Like I already mentioned, Takeru tried to develop by learning the importance of life and to stop relying on others, but like I previously mentioned, he already knows the former, and the latter is a non-issue that never gets resolved. Mayu is just a giant plot device. She has the Alexander icon for some reason, and that's the entire reason why the villains are after her. Also, the fact that she's supposed to be the last important person Takeshi has feels really disrespectful, as I've mentioned before. The villains are Nova Shocker and Shocker. Nova Shocker just wants to rule the world's economy, which is why they split from Shocker, even though Shocker was confirmed to be ruling the economy in the shadows in the original series. Shocker is back, and not Joe Shocker or Baran, and Ambassador Hell is revived for some dumb reason. Bleh. At least Ambassador Hell has more characterization compared to his portrayal in the original series, but the other villains are just bad and pointless. Now the story. I've already mentioned a bunch of issues with the portrayal of Takeshi in this film, but there were other issues I've had. Early on in this film, there was a love triangle because it's Inoue writing this film, of course there needs to be a love triangle. Takeshi also has a new form for no reason, and despite the fact that his body is breaking down, it's more powerful than his original form. There are also a bunch of scene transition that leaves the viewers no time to digest what just happened, and at the end of the film, Takeshi is revived because of magical bullshit. Speaking of that revival scene, it fell off. It happens because Mayu wants Takeshi to come back, and then Takeshi comes back because everyone's hearts are connected. You know, you could have just presented his revival as multiple people wanting him to come back, or Mayu wishing him to come back to help others as a better way to convey the message that Kamen Riders fight for everyone. But no, it's the result of Mayu forgiving Takeshi and asking him to come back for herself. So yeah, this film in my opinion was a mess that completely botched Takeshi as a character. It felt like the film purposely backslided in Takeshi and Takeru's characters just to reteach lessons both of them should already know. The villains were boring and generic, and the story was filled with issues and wrong ideas about Takeshi. But even though I hate this film, I do like the attempt to develop these characters, and there were some emotional moments. But god, this film was just terrible. Well, I won't rant about this movie for that long, if you're worried that the last entry was anything to go off of. Well, this comment may be unwarranted, but I consider The Last Judgment to be the best thing from the Amazons franchise, but even this film wasn't that great. There was a lot of padding, mainly because most of the scenes were just dedicated to, oh, the cruel reality of humans eating Amazons because humans are at the top of the food chain, oh, the humanity. I mean, yeah, it fits into Amazon's message of whether it's right for Amazons to eat humans to survive, but the way this theme was incorporated in this film just led to a lot of fluff. Now with the characters, Haruka was alright, but felt he had no presence in this film. He also felt kinda different compared to Season 2. I mean, in Season 2, he was more connected with Amazons, but now he cares more about humanity than Amazons. Then again, this film does basically act as if Season 2 never happened. I mean, that is for the better in my opinion. The only major thing about his character was going against his moral to never eat someone, but after a reminder to always protect everyone, he just gets out of that real quick. Jin was kinda pointless, and also bad. All he really did was spout, I will kill all Amazons because redemption, and that's it. Now we get to the villain, Mito, and he's also kinda bad. He believes that humans are superior to Amazons, and that's it, and then he dies. The plot of this movie led to a lot of issues. Haruka's trying to stop a new scheme to breed Amazons for the sole purpose of slaughtering them for food. However, for some reason, these Amazons don't dissolve into black goop. Sometimes? Also, these Amazons, which are created from Jin's Amazon cells, don't hunger for meat because they're vegetarian and have never eaten meat before, so that's why they don't crave it. But shouldn't they still crave protein because they're created from Jin's Amazon cells? And while it does push the question of, is it right for humans to breed Amazons that exist solely for food, it never goes any further than just bringing up that question. Hell, the film never points out the numerous other animals we breed just for food, like cows and poultry. This film also ends on a cliffhanger and hinting at a possible follow-up, even though this film was heralded as the finale to Amazons. Overall, this movie felt bland and empty. The theme of is it right for humans to eat Amazons felt pointless since it shouldn't even be possible to eat the remains of a dead Amazon in the first place. Haruka didn't do much, and Jin did even less. Mito felt like he was just there because we need a movie exclusive writer, and the ending just felt inconclusive. However, once again, there were some good emotional moments, and I liked part of Haruka's development. Too bad it doesn't save this film.
Well, I may have spoken too soon about not ranting for too long. Rebirth Spectre is, like expected at this point, a giant mess. Despite focusing on Makoto, I feel like this movie did nothing to expand on his character and personality, but rather just randomly reveal revelations about his past that come out of nowhere that add nothing to him. Makoto's whole dilemma is discovering he's actually not human, but an artificial one created by Danton. This then causes him to freak out and become depressed, but then at the very end, he just seemingly accepts it. Why? It's because this film went from a theme of what does it mean to be human to accepting all my sins at the very end. Additionally, his depression was furthered because he believes no one will treat him as a human once they discover the truth, even though his friends have always treated him as one. It's not like they treated you as a human just because you were born human. With the others, Alon does nothing except gain a new power-up and immediately gets defeated. Takaru and the rest don't do anything either, just fill the film with random fluff. Danton is the main villain and he's just weird. The dude either acts like a lunatic psychopath or a loving father. One moment he's mocking Adonis for his ideals and threatens anyone who goes against him, and the next he deeply cares about Makoto and Kanon and gives them helpful advice. It just makes his character feel inconsistent. His whole motivation behind his plan was disappointing too. At first, it seems like he truly wants to help the Ganma people by creating a perfect world, and will do anything to save them, even if it means performing human experimentation. But at the end of the film, that just gets dropped in favor of God Complex, since he reveals all he wants to do is just to prove his way is correct, and anyone who disagrees with him must die. Now the story. Ugh. First off, Copy Makoto got retconned to not be a side effect of the Deep Spectre icon, and instead being other versions of Makoto. However, this then means there is no explanation as to why Makoto and Copy Makoto were mentally connected to each other. Saionji is reintroduced only to die for no reason, and Gyro is just killed off for no reason. However, the biggest issue I have with this film isn't with the story, it's the actions of the heroes. Yeah, you heard that right. So, the entire reason why Takaru and the others tell the Ganma residents not to follow Danton and try to stop him is because modification is wrong because it takes away your humanity. Here's the thing, this franchise has always associated modification with loss of humanity, but that's because the original Kamen Riders were rebuilt to be nothing but weapons. But even despite being remodeled, Takeshi and Haito still had their humanity with them. While they weren't filled with flesh and blood, they still cared for others like a normal human being. Let's take Blade for example. Even though Kanzaki may have lost his human form, does that mean he's lost his humanity? And if you argue that Kanzaki did sacrifice his humanity to save the world, then does that mean Hajime never had humanity in him to begin with? What about the Roidmudes, the Bugsters, the Taros, Philip, Kenko, and many other characters? Do all of these characters not have humanity simply because they weren't born with flesh and blood? To me, Heisei Kamen Rider, especially Phase 2, tried to redefine humanity as not just someone being born of flesh and blood, but rather a mindset. To be kind towards everyone, no matter their race, gender, or what their body is made of. To give hope towards others, and to protect those they care about. If our hearts and goals align, is it fair to say that one is not human simply because they aren't made of flesh and blood? That's why I'm actually okay with Danton's plan. I don't condone him forcefully experimenting on other humans just to complete his research, but now, he's just leaving it up to the people, and all he's doing is remodeling their bodies just so they can live in the hostile Ganma world. He's not even planning to corrupt their minds. Yes, Argos had the same plan, but Argos also forced that decision upon everyone else. So for everyone to go against Danton because being remodeled means you won't be human, in a franchise that has constantly proven that humanity isn't just defined by what you're made of, it feels oddly backwards. Yeah, sure, this ends up not mattering since Danton ends up being revealed as an insane person who does need to be taken down, but the point still stands since this was the reason why everyone is against Danton for the majority of the film. So yeah, overall, this film was just off to me. Makoto didn't really develop meaningfully since all he learned about was his origins. Danton was an inconsistent villain that ended up being cliched, and the story had plot holes and things that didn't really resonate with me. Still, at least there were some good character moments with Makoto, and I did like some of the shots of the film, especially anything that features Sin Spectre. It's a shame he was only shown twice. Well, after that long rant, it's time to talk about another movie that focuses on Blue Rider. Episode Blue, The Dispatch Imagine is neutral, I have no idea what they were going for with that title, is a movie solely dedicated to Kotaro and Teddy. That's a good thing, right? We can finally learn about Mr. Cardboard and his sidekick. Well, unfortunately, this movie does not do anything to actually expand on either of these characters. The film sees Teddy being stripped away from Kotaro because Teddy's contract has run out, which doesn't even make sense given that none of the other Taros even have contracts, but whatever. Then we spend the rest of the movie with both characters going, "Wah, I miss my partner." Teddy suddenly dies, but then he comes back because the power of friendship. So great, another Den-O film dedicated to showing the bonds between the Taros and the contractor. Sure, Kotaro says he becomes more independent, but the film never even shows him becoming more independent. And Teddy? He does nothing. Well, so much for having hopes that this movie would actually make me like these characters more. Also, the villain? It's just a random Imagine with nothing special about it. Great. And the story. Oh boy. Once again, this film has a lot of stuff that either comes out of nowhere or contradicts the lore of Den-O. Teddy seemingly has a timed contract, meaning he has to switch owners every so often, and if he decides to leave his new owner, he could die. Yeah, where did this element even come from? Oh yeah, Teddy's new owner in this film? It's Owner. And he suddenly acts like a complete dick for no reason. Hell, he doesn't even have a reason for suddenly wanting Teddy to cease his contract with Kotaro and start working for him instead. Another thing is that a contract ticket, for some reason, is treated as granting the user the ability to time travel, even though it's only used to guide the Den Rider to a destination in time. Now, there was one good thing about this movie that I liked. Too bad it didn't have anything to do with what was actually happening. The subplot of the film is about this mysterious case of a girl named Miku, with two of them suddenly appearing at the same time. It turns out that one of them is actually from the future, who wanted to spend time with her grandmother since she died in the future. While this subplot had really touching moments, it unfortunately did nothing to connect with the actual stuff with Kotaro and Teddy, besides sharing the message of always cherish the time with your loved ones because you never know how much time they have left. So overall, this film was just boring, with the only memorable part about this movie being the subplot with Miku. Everything else was repetitive. Why did we even need a movie focusing on the relationship between Teddy and Kotaro when we barely know anything about either character? It would have been better had this film focused on their first meeting. That way, we would know their character and relationship better. Oh well, too bad I can't change the past. Now it's time for the Showa films to take the spotlight now. We'll be blazing through these next films quite quickly. Starting off this trend is Kamen Rider vs. Shocker. This is basically just a standard episode of Kamen Rider, but with a slightly bigger budget. The plot's forgettable, nothing much happens with the characters, and the villains are bland. Yeah, this criticism pretty much applies to most Showa movies. However, what makes it so terrible is the big bad plan Shocker has. They want to use a device to sink Japan to the bottom of the sea. Yeah, how are you gonna rule over Japan if it's SeaWorld? Also, why in the world did the scientists create such a deadly device that has no beneficial use? Still, these movies are harmless, which is why it doesn't fall into the 1 out of 10 rating, but that doesn't mean they're good. Now it's Black's first movie, Hurry to Onegaishima. Plot, boring. Character development, non-existent. Villains, stupid. Now onto the unique stuff about this film that makes it bad. This film feels like they started in the middle of a regular episode of Black. There's no build-up, no explanation of what's going on, we just immediately start with Kotaro searching for some dastardly Gorgon mutant. Oh yeah, and to make up for skipping the build-up, they just extend every fight scene by like 50%. So great, now I'm both bored and confused. And Gorgon's plan is just actually stupid. They want to turn Kotaro into a mutant, so they lock him up until the perfect time occurs, completely ignoring the fact that they have the perfect opportunity to take back the Kingstone. You know, the thing that they have been constantly after for the entire season? But still, this film feels more cohesive than Kamen Rider vs. Shocker, and the cameo of Shotaro Ishinomori was cool, which is why it earns enough brownie points to rank above Kamen Rider vs. Shocker. Now it's Black's second film, Terrifying, The Demon House of Devil's Pass. So, why is it better than Hurry to Onegaishima? Well, it's because this film actually has a proper beginning section. Plus, it had a fight between Kotaro and Shadow Moon, even though they don't do anything meaningful besides that. Too bad Shadow Moon's plan is actually pretty dumb. He plans to build a giant robot in Yubari because Yubari has a lot of energy. The reasoning behind why Yubari has a bunch of energy? It's because the name means Land of Spring Water. Alright. Not much else I can say about this film. I'm running out of creative ways to introduce these films. Kamen Rider Amazon the movie is the theatrical version of Amazon's 16th episode, so this is actually just a regular episode of Kamen Rider. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward in its plot. The only flaws it has are that it utilizes some bad Showa tropes, such as the monster telling the plan to the protagonist for no reason, but that's about it. Next. Kamen Rider vs. Ambassador Hell is pretty standard for a Showa movie. Basic plot with Takeshi stopping Ambassador Hell from some evil plot. However, there are some obvious signs of padding, mainly because this film introduces a bunch of fight scenes that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Oh well, at least it doesn't pull that many bad tropes. Plus, it has a consistent story, so that's why it's better than everything that's come before. Finally, we have something new. Pretty Den-O is what I like to call part of the short film franchise. This film is only about 30 minutes long. Now, this film focuses on a completely new character named Anna. She hates her mom, and then afterwards, she doesn't because she found out that the friend she made back in 1989 was actually her own mother. What's with Den-O movies and having weird stories about families? Anyways, this film was pretty meh. There's barely any plot, the characters don't have much to them, and the villains are pretty stupid. Seriously, Shocker's entire point was just to have dumb comedy inserted in. Actually, now that I think about it, everything in this film felt like it was just there for comedy. Shocker, the Taros, the story. So yeah, while it wasn't terrible, there isn't much to like about this film. However, there wasn't too much bad stuff, which is why it's given a 3 out of 10, and it's mostly just harmless fun. Harmless, bad fun. Well, you know how I mentioned that Pretty Den-O was part of the short film franchise? Run All Over the World is the second film I consider to be part of that franchise. Yeah, this film is short. It's 14 minutes long. So, as you can see, there's really not much they can do with the plot or characters. The Crisis Empire sends Kotaro back in time to his time against Gorgon, and then somehow, the future forms of Kotaro all team up to fight together, and then they win. It is pretty cool to see all 4 forms of Kotaro fight together, but my main issue, or rather nitpick, is that the time travel stuff isn't really that clear. Did the Crisis Empire send Kotaro back in time, or revert him to an earlier state? But he still has his current memories, so... Okay, now I'm really getting nitpicky. And boy, if you thought Run All Over the World was short. Kamen Rider World is an 8-minute film featuring Zero and Jay teaming up against Shadow Moon and his forces. How can this be a movie, you may ask? Well, this movie is included in the Kamen Rider the Movie Blu-ray box, so I think that definitely concludes that this is indeed a movie. Anyways, even though this film is literally just an 8-minute fight scene, it does have a more sensible plot than Run All Over the World. But since this is just nothing but a fight scene, I can't really rank it any higher than this. Funny how a literal 8-minute fight scene ranks higher than 32 movies. That's gotta say something about my taste. Okay, now we're back to the proper films.
君が抱きしめているのはあの日の約束
Yeah, Kamen Rider Eternal didn't really succeed in what it was trying to do. This film was supposed to give backstory on Katsumi and make him look like a fallen hero from grace, but if you analyze the story, that doesn't really happen at all. In the film, Katsumi helps a group of psychics called Quarks by trying to help them escape the island they're held captive on, but after they're all murdered, Katsumi goes insane and becomes a villain hellbent on causing chaos. So it sounds like he was always a good guy, right? Well, even from the very beginning of the film, Katsumi was always hellbent on causing chaos and death in order to take revenge against the museum. He had already planned to construct the X-Picker, which would turn humans into zombies called Necro-Overs. Hell, the reason he was on said island was because he was on a mission as a mercenary, a job that was most likely taken to fund the construction of the X-Picker. In this movie's attempt to humanize Katsumi, we constantly see contradicting info from him. He has this moral code that sees him taking down people only if they willingly enter into battle, and to save those that want to be saved. However, he's shown to have a total disregard for any life that isn't a Necro-Over, shown by how he's killed soldiers that might have not even been willing to fight, but rather drafted into service, and the fact he's already started construction of the X-Picker. If anything, this movie was more about him being insane, back to human for a split second, than back to insane again. Onto the topic of the other characters. We get some backstory for each of the Never crew, but that's about it. Mina's just there to be the narrator of this film, and also be the one who caused Katsumi's descent into villainy. The villain of this film, Dr. Prospect, is pretty generic, even for Double standards. We also do get some focus on Junkazu, but all that's revealed about him in this film is why he became a Necro-Over, and that he's also a Quark. With the story, while it does have some good elements, a lot of the bad mainly comes with this film making a bunch of retcons that make the events of Double Forever look stupid. Now, it's revealed in this film that all Necro-Overs need a cell rejuvenating serum just to stay alive, which means that Katsumi's plan in Double Forever to turn everyone in Futo into Necro-Overs is now even stupider in hindsight, since everyone in Futo would have eventually died since there wouldn't be enough serums to keep everyone alive. Additionally, despite Katsumi claiming he is slowly losing his memories, we can clearly see that is not true in Double Forever, since he references a melody that his mother used to play while he was a teenager. Even the self-contained story this film has does have its faults. The eternal memory glitches out and breaks when Kazu uses it, but when Katsumi uses it, it suddenly repairs itself, which makes no sense. The Mina could track Katsumi's memories despite Katsumi slowly losing his memories plot point is baffling. The whole we have to stop Dr. Prospect from using a device that could kill all the weak quarks felt pointless given that Dr. Prospect could just kill them all even without that device, and Mina surviving after her supposed death made no sense. Though this film still had some enjoyable moments. The fight scenes were entertaining, and I liked the expansion on June. However, the bland story, the retcons that make Katsumi and Double Forever look even stupider, and failing to make Katsumi more humane causes this movie to suffer greatly. Well, it's finally time to talk about a Heisei Phase 1 movie that isn't Den-O. Godspeed Love just felt like a snooze fest. There really wasn't anything interesting that stood out to me. The only character I enjoyed was Tendo, mainly because of how much charm he usually has, but even that felt toned down in this film, making his character less enjoyable in my opinion. The other characters felt pointless, or changed to the point of being unrecognizable from their good TV counterparts. Kagami is no longer the everyman that we loved in this show, but rather a fiancé to Hiyori, and that's it. Such a disappointment. Speaking of Hiyori, besides being Kagami's fiancé, she also has an illness for some reason, and then she dies. Yeah, that's all she gets in this film. Now, before I go on to the other characters, I want to explain the basic plot of this film. In an alternate universe, an even bigger meteor hit the Earth, causing all the water on Earth to dry up and bringing millions of worms that quickly took over Earth. Zechs quickly formed to deal with the threat, but Neo-Zechs soon formed afterwards and fought against them. Now, every member in Neo-Zechs felt pointless and unexplored. They wanted to take over the world because freedom, and that's all we know. Hell, why did they even split from Zechs in the first place? And the main villain, Issei, has got to be one of the worst movie villains in Kamen Rider. He appears at the literal end of this film out of nowhere, and he wants the worms to rule over Earth because the strong should survive. Yeah, he's bad. Now the story, and man, not only is it slow, it feels like the first 2/3 of this film don't even matter in the slightest. You could probably skip the entire section and still not miss anything of importance. The relationship between Hiyori and Kagami, the war between Zect and Neosect, all there just for drama without substance. Hell, the whole living in a world without water felt underutilized, and it's not until the final third where we finally have some semblance of plot, mainly to make sure the Ladder of Heaven project doesn't go awry, since it's the only shot of Earth gaining back its water. Until it turns out that this was actually all part of Zect's plans to basically genocide humanity because it's a mercy killing. Yeah, no, that plot twist was completely stupid. Overall, this film was just a disappointing mess. All the new characters and villains lacked any sense of charm, character, or motivation. All the returning characters either got watered down to the point of barely being the same as their TV counterparts, or not mattering in the slightest, and the plot was slow and boring, with pretty much the last 15 minutes actually being dedicated to the main plot, while the rest of the film was dedicated to either Neosect or Kagami and Hiyori's love problems, with neither of them mattering in the grand scheme of things. However, Tendo does bring up the enjoyability quite a bit, and this film does at least have a cohesive story. Plus, the ending does explain a lot about the TV show's lore, which is neat, though that explanation isn't worth sitting through this movie. Well, so much for not having a Heisei movie that isn't Den-O.
夢で会えたらほらどんな言葉で君を抱き寄せる
Yes, it's Den-O's first movie, I'm Born. The build-up to this film was quite interesting, mainly because the show spent 3 episodes building up to this film. However, the actual payoff was quite disappointing. Despite being one of the first Heisei movies to not be set in an alternate universe, this film really doesn't utilize the TV cast in the best way possible. Ryotaro just felt like your typical weak hero in the film, and he doesn't really grow or change in any meaningful way, besides learning what his parents looked like. Yeah, that's his entire arc in this film. Kotaro was just Ryotaro, but younger. And just for clarification, I don't mean Kotaro Nogami, who's Ryotaro's grandson. Kotaro in this context refers to the nickname given to Ryotaro's younger self. Kotaro's role in this film felt completely unnecessary, since despite him being a gateway for learning more about Ryotaro's past, everything that Kotaro reveals is something that Ryotaro shared in the first few minutes of this film. Yuto and the Taros, except Momotaro's, felt completely wasted, since they barely did anything in this film. Hell, despite Sig being the Taros with the second most focus, he barely got any chance to shine or develop. Now we get to Gao. He's just a brute and he wants to erase time, starting with Ryotaro's birth because he's bored of time, I guess. Yeah, he's terrible. Also, like I mentioned when I talked about Final Countdown, shouldn't his plan to erase Ryotaro from time by erasing the time when he was born just not work? Since, well, Ryotaro is a singularity point after all. Hell, Kai erased time in the finale, but even that didn't erase Ryotaro from time. Finally, the story. It had issues in the beginning, but once we got to the Edo period, that's where this film just goes bonkers with its story and starts pulling stuff out of their ass. Most of the Taros are captured by Gao and his forces, and how are they freed from their cage? With Owner breaking it by hitting it with his miniature flag. You could have done that from the very beginning, dude. For some dumb reason, Ryotaro has amnesia, and for that reason, none of the Taros can possess him, except Sig because plot convenience. Then Ryotaro just so happens to regain his memories at the perfect time so he can fight again because even more plot convenience? How time is restored doesn't make any sense, given that time is restored only after Gao is defeated and not the Gao liner, which is the reason why time was erased, and also that it just proves my point that Gao's plan wouldn't have worked since Hana would be there to remember Ryotaro and thus bring him back when time was erased. And the final fight scene was just disappointing, with it just being a compilation of just a bunch of fight scenes and then Momotaro's finishing off Gao. However, the build up to this film was great, and the character moments between Momotaros and Ryotaro was heartwarming, but this film is still quite bad. While the first half was decent, the second half is where this film really gets sloppy. Nothing really interesting happens with the characters, Gao was a pretty bad villain, and the story just had a lot of elements that needed clarification. Plus, this movie does mark for me when Den-O starts degrading in quality, so that's not helping this movie's case much. Well, we've gone through 7 of Den-O's films, which means this next film is my favorite Den-O film. Yeah, I consider Episode Red the best of Den-O's films, but even then, it's not the greatest. It's really only saved by the premise of this film, that being an expansion of Yuto and Airi's relationship. However, there really isn't that much when it comes to expanding the relationship. We basically get 2 scenes that last a total of 18 minutes focusing on the relationship, and what basically happens in those scenes is Airi telling Yuto that, I can't love you because you and Sakurai are different people. Then at the end of the film, Airi tells Yuto that, I think I can love you now because you are similar to Sakurai and also because Sakurai is dead. Seriously, that's it? What a waste. Now, why did these two get so little screen time and development? Because the Dunwiner crew had to be pushed into this movie as well. Everything they do in this film was a complete waste of time with no merit whatsoever. All they did was just comedic stuff, which severely hindered the enjoyability of this film. That's not even mentioning the villain of this film, which is once again another random Imogen. In addition to the pointless comedy, there are still some story issues this film has, such as Irie somehow remembering Sakura despite all memories of him being gone, the Imogen hijacking the Dunwiner for no reason, and the Imogen now going into the past to live out their lives as the contractor instead of causing chaos in the past. And speaking of the story, there really wasn't even one in the first place, it just felt bare bones as hell. This movie had so much potential to be much, much more interesting than it was. How about we solely focus on Yuto and Irie's relationship and get rid of the Dunwiner crew? How about the Imogen is Imogen based off Yuto's desire to be with Irie, or his hatred for Sakurai because he constantly feels like he needs to live up to him? How about we get more development for both of these characters? Still, for as small as it was, I did like the scenes we got with Irie and Yuto, and the story didn't have as many logical gaps as I'm Born. Oh well, I guess we can close the book on Den-O movies now. Well, time to jump back a couple of decades.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
8 Riders vs. Galaxy King's faults can be summed up in 2 words: missed opportunities. Galaxy King as a character was extremely interesting to me. He was an alien invader that teamed up with Neo Shocker. However, he really didn't have much other than that. Why did he want the Sigma energy, and how did he come to know about it? Why did he team up with Neo Shocker in the first place? Even his demise was anticlimactic, since instead of being brought down by the Kamen Riders, he just failed to escape from an exploding base in time. Honestly, I would have liked it had they had Galaxy King or Neo Shocker back instead of the other to at least add something interesting to their relationship in this film. Character-wise, none of the protagonists don't really change or get much, but it's a Showa film, that's to be expected. At least the plot was interesting in the first half. The villains are absolute dog because the scientists uploaded the data of the Sigma energy into its brain, which is just one of the greatest Showa plots I've ever heard. Too bad the pacing of this film just makes it suffer so much. The second half of this film is nothing but one giant fight scene, and you know me, having an extended fight scene with nothing but the sole purpose of having a fight scene does not rank highly in my eyes. Hell, the last 5 minutes of this film are dedicated to watching the same base blow up. This film had an intriguing start, but when it just evolved into nothing but mindless fight scenes, that's when this film really lost me. The returning Riders just felt like an afterthought in my opinion, given how they just showed up out of nowhere for the final fight scene. What's with some Kamen Rider films having really long titles? Kiva's film, The King of the Castle in the Demon World, is kinda generic honestly. I did like what they did with Wataru and Otoya's interactions in this movie, with Wataru coming to accept his father and learn life lessons from him, but honestly, that's really all I liked about this film. Everyone else just felt pointless or forgettable. Hell, the film could have been filled with nothing but Wataru and Otoya's interactions, but I'll take what I can get. The villains of this film are pretty wasted in my opinion. Kamen Rider Rei, or Takato, felt really out of place. He's built up as his rival to Nago, but we never really get an explanation for his hatred for Nago. His entire motivation just boils down to gaining power, and that's it. Honestly, they really didn't even need to include him in this film, because we already had another villain in this film. The main villain, Kamen Rider Arc, is a spirit that possesses a prisoner named Takeshi, and he wants revenge against Kiva for stealing him. So yeah, neither villain is exactly good villain material. It's a shame too, since they could have cut Rei from this film to focus more on Arc and his backstory, though preferably, I wish it was Rei that got more focus over Arc since he actually seemed to have something interesting to his character. Now, the story does have its problems and issues, such as Wataru suddenly being freed from his brainwashing because of Power of Family, and Takato being baptized by Arc despite the fact that Arc wouldn't even be awake at the time, but my main issue is that this film just feels heavily padded. The film begins with some fluff about Wataru having to attend school while Nago meets with Takato. Then later on, after finding out that Arc has awakened, Wataru goes back to the past to defeat Arc before he can become a menace, eventually teaming with Otoya to take out Arc. However, when that fails, Otoya and Yuri appear in the present day to help defeat Arc for good. So yeah, I basically summed up the entire film in about 3 sentences. And that's not even delving into all the shenanigans that happened in the past, the whole subplot about a musician named Toa and her daughter, and the final act where Yuri and Megumi have been kidnapped, Wataru goes berserk, and Nago and Takato settle their duel. Though, for as much fluff there is in this film that doesn't amount to much, I still prefer a padded film over a film that just constantly makes up stuff for its story. Plus, the moments and interactions between Wataru and Otoya, for as small as it was, were pretty good. Still, there were a lot of things in this film that could have been better utilized. Well, we might as well end this part with a very important movie. Go-Go Kamen Rider is the first film of the entire franchise, and it's just the theatrical version of episode 13. So yeah. However, the reason it ranks so far, despite being a regular show episode, is that we do see some growth with Takeshi, as he trains himself after losing against the monster for the week. Even though this film doesn't have as many character moments, interesting villains, or engaging plots as some of the movies before it, this film doesn't really have that many faults aside from being forgettable. Plus, even if there basically wasn't any story, this film was still quite entertaining. So yeah, this film ranks above everything else so far for those reasons.